Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My first trip to Little Rock, so I'm very excited and eager to talk about my recently released book. I think I want to start just by giving a frame of why Iran was such a gripping story for me to tell, and also why understanding the Iran conflict over the past decade really is kind of a framework to understand what happened under the Bush administration, what happened under Obama, and what is likely to play out under a Trump administration. The early stages of this book were really set by what was transpiring in the last 2 to 3 years of the George H.W. Bush administration. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, in a lot of ways, were morphing into a proxy war, and the U.S. was becoming more and more kind of obsessed with the advances in Iran's nuclear program. As this was playing out, you could see very much that kind of two camps were starting to break down in the in the Middle East, were starting to form. On the one hand, you had the United States and its allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and on the other hand, you had Iran and what was kind of, you've heard the early, at least when I first started, heard of the term the axis of resistance, which was the Iranian regime, its Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Palestinian territories, Islamic Jihad, and various Shia militias that were starting to form in Iraq and other countries. So you could really feel towards the end of the Obama administration the Bush administration, that this was a widening conflict, not just between the United States, but two camps. And it was getting increasingly hot, whether it was the war in Lebanon in 2006 between Hezbollah on the one hand and Israel. This was the burgeoning of a much bigger conflict, and you could start to feel that. And what was also becoming quite clear towards the end of the Bush administration was that the Iranian threat, this conflict, was creating entirely new tools of national security architecture that hadn't been really developed before. Cyber warfare, kind of the development of these attacks on Iran's enrichment program was starting sort of at the end of the Bush administration. And what I really focused on a lot in this book was financial warfare that had never really been developed before. You'd had sanctions against Saddam Hussein during the Iraq period that were very much through the United Nations, very much kind of a trade embargo type program that was very loose, that was very weak. You could feel towards the end of the Bush administration that something much broader was happening. This was kind of a very vast program that was starting to get cooked up in the U.S. Treasury Department under Bush, that was really going to target every aspect of the Iranian economy. And this brought us into the Obama administration and the early years. And, you know, it was interesting, even in the 2008 campaign, you could feel that Barack Obama was making Iran kind of his signature foreign policy. This was going to be his Nixon in China moment. This was going to be his kind of key issue on the international stage. And in a lot of ways, the book is about, you know, why was Barack Obama so obsessed with Iran? What was it about trying to build some sort of rapprochement towards a country that has been so hostile to the United States since the '79 revolution? You know, what was it? And I think I really tried to frame early on that the Obama administration saw Iran as kind of an elixir, that if you could, there were so many different strains of problems in the Middle East that kind of flowed through Iran, whether it was their support for groups inside Iraq that were targeting the United States, to its support for militias that were fighting Israel, whether it was Hezbollah or Hamas. If you could solve this conflict, if you could build some sort of rapprochement, President Obama believed that there would be a wider kind kind of flow. There'd be these other conflicts in the region would start to solve themselves. And also, I think the one issue that President Obama really focused on when he was still a senator was the issue of atomic weapons, nuclear proliferation. Early on, he knew that Iran and its advancing nuclear program could be the first really big crisis of his tenure, that the Israelis were kind of sitting there and talking about attacks that could, without a doubt, bring the United States into a wider war in which these different camps that I was just articulating would all be brought into. So I think this was in Obama's mind, and you could see from the early days of his administration, through these secret letters he started to write to the Ayatollah Khomeini, that he wanted to change the relationship. He was describing the country for the first time as the Islamic Republic, something American presidents did not want to do. They didn't want to sort of legitimize this regime that overthrew the Shah and was basically founded on the idea of being in opposition to the United States, on pushing back against the Americans and the Israelis and the Saudis in the Middle East. So President Obama very much, this was his fixation from day one. And in the book, I think, in a lot of ways, it was an incredibly successful strategy that President Obama started to develop. If you remember, towards the end of the Bush administration, there really was this kind of toxic belief that the United States was to blame for the problems in the Middle East, that the Iranian nuclear program was sort of being overblown by the United States and Israel, that the U.S., because of its military operations, was hostile towards the United States, and that the Iranians kind of had a good reason for pursuing some sort of deterrent. And I think President Obama was very successful at weaving together a coalition of countries that in a lot of ways have very different interests. You have the Israelis and the Saudis that see Iran essentially as an existential threat. You have the Europeans that want to trade with them. You have the Chinese and the Russians that in some ways are allied with the Iranians, support their military programs. So he was very effective in kind of flipping the calculus to kind of put the pressure on Iran. The United States was willing to negotiate. If the Iranians were willing to engage, he was right there. And I think that was a very effective diplomatic overture to bring all these countries that have such differing interests in the Middle East into some sort of coalition. And I don't think you can underestimate how brilliant, in a lot of ways, this financial war that was developed towards the end of the Bush administration into Obama was. It really started in 2006. And if you look how kind of mapped out this financial war was, it started with a focus on state banks, and then it grew to include basically every sector of the Iranian economy, from their airlines, shipping companies. It was a very escalating financial war that was mapped out from the very earliest days. And I think if you could see from where the United States started in 2006 to where we were in 2012, the United States basically took Iran's oil exports and cut them by more than half, which is not an easy thing to do, because you had the Secretary of Treasury under Bush and then Secretary Geithner under Obama warning the diplomats, warning the Treasury people that, if you really do attack Iran's oil exports, you could cause a huge spike in international energy markets that could very much boomerang and hit the United States in return. And so this was all weighing on the United States' mind, and it was a very interesting diplomatic overture to watch, where you had, from Obama's early days, you saw American diplomats going to India or to China or to some of these other countries and basically mapping out to them that the United States very much knows that these countries are worried about the threat of an attack, by an Israeli attack on these countries, and that if these countries wanted to avoid their energy supplies being cut off, that they needed to get on board. And this process very much started to bring success. In 2012, you saw Iran's oil exports cut in half. You saw them cut off basically from the international banking system, and you saw them basically cut off something called the SWIFT network, which was the international system that brings all these banks together. So when you were cut off from the SWIFT bank network, you basically had no choice but to engage in barter trade. So I think this were the very high points of the Obama diplomacy. This was why I think you saw Iran kind of come to the table in 2013, first in secret talks and then eventually in public talks. But in the book, I really do try to show, too, that there was always a cost to the Obama diplomacy. There was always some sort of cost to engaging Iran. I think the first part, which a lot of people don't really remember right now, was that in 2009, you had a huge political uprising against the regime with the re-election of Ahmadinejad in 2009. The millions of people took to the streets and were basically accusing the regime of cooking the election. And this was a very difficult decision, I think, for the President Obama, and probably in his first term, one of the most controversial decisions he made, which was, does the United States kind of embrace this green movement, this opposition movement? And in the book, I really focus on the differing kind of advice he was getting. Some people were telling him, you should definitely embrace this movement to some degree, even if you can't overthrow the regime. At least the United States will be out there morally supporting the uprising. You could give some sort of political cover for the people on the streets so the regime doesn't crack down. Another camp was saying, look, if the United States intervenes, if we publicly back this green movement, the Iranian government is just going to basically brand them as lackeys of the United States. They'll be able to discredit this movement and will use that as a reason to crack down. And there was a lot of back and forth, and in the end, President Obama very much stayed silent in the very kind of key first few weeks of this uprising. Not only stayed silent, but in some ways made some public statements that question whether political change in Iran will really make much of a difference. And I argue through my reporting that, and I heard it from people around Obama, that he had already started investing in this nuclear diplomacy, in this outreach to the supreme leader, that if you were seen as interfering in these political changes, the nuclear diplomacy would get derailed. So in the end, the U.S. very much, in a lot of ways, stayed silent, and the regime did very much crack down against this opposition. And I think there's a lot of concern now that a window had kind of closed, that there was a chance for some political change. I think it's debatable. We probably won't know for a while, but staying silent did have some cost, I think, when you look back. And it was ironic that the United States stayed so silent when you see what happened in 2011 when there were uprisings in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, when the Americans really did call even for allies to step aside and used military operations in Libya to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. So it was strange the United States would stay so silent in Iran when we were so aggressive in these other countries. And I argue in the book that the focus on the nuclear deal was already impacting. I also think another cost was so much of this diplomacy was done in secret, not in coordination with U.S. allies in the region, whether it was Israel or Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, some of these really close allies. And I think I could understand why he had to do this in secret in Oman, kind of behind the curtain. There was so much potential for these countries to try to undercut this process, to sabotage it, which is definitely what we saw in the second term when Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was so publicly opposed to the Iran nuclear deal. But I think it's important to realize that it wasn't just the Israelis. I think the Saudis and some of these other Gulf states were equal, if not more, concerned about this agreement. They just weren't as vocal about it. And I think if you see what's been going on in the Middle East in the past couple of years, it really has turned into this confrontation between the Saudis and the Iranians, between Sunni and Shia. And I think President Obama's strategy in some ways was, okay, we can normalize or at least improve relations with Iran, and we could be better positioned to try to resolve the conflict between these two camps. I think, at least in the early stages, you probably could make the argument the exact opposite has happened. The Saudis have become so kind of paranoid that the United States is reaching out to Iran, that we're trying to change relations that have gone back past decades. And I think that's why, whether it's the civil war in Syria or the conflict in Yemen, it's metastasized in such a vicious way because a lot of these countries that are allied with the United States are not so sure about where we stand. And as a result, you could see these heavy military operations in Yemen, support for militant groups in Syria, and this conflict that is just kind of unending. And I think the last and probably the most controversial issue tied to the Iran deal is what's happened in Syria. President Obama has very publicly and been debated in 2013 said, you know, if the Assad regime uses chemical weapons inside Syria against its own people, we will respond. We will respond militarily. And they use chemical weapons, and I can tell you that the French, the Saudis, they were just waiting for the Americans to go, and President Obama backed off. And I argue in the book there are a lot of different reasons. I think there was definitely concerns about Congress. There was a lot of concerns about the U.S. getting sucked into another escalating conflict, that he was elected to get out of these wars. So I'm not minimizing those issues as far as impacting him. But what was interesting when you have the time when you're writing a book and you can't do as kind of the day-to-day was, if you look at the sort of the weeks when President Obama U-turned on Syria. This is the August of 2013 when he had this famous anecdote of him walking through the White House with one of his aides and then deciding, okay, we're not going to go in. But this was happening at the precise moment that the Americans and the Iranians were having these very high-level talks in the Sultanate of Oman on the nuclear issue. And they essentially were getting to the point where, give or take a few issues, they were basically reaching an interim agreement on the nuclear issue. And the Iranian officials I interviewed for the book were saying, look, a U.S. attack on Syria, on the Assad regime, was basically seen by the Ayatollahs in Tehran, the elite military force, this Revolutionary Guard, as an existential threat to Iran. Syria is Iran's closest ally. It provides strategic depth to the Iranian regime in that arms flows to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the Palestinian groups, flow through Syria. So an attack on the Assad regime was seen as very much an existential threat to Syria. And even the Iranian diplomats who wanted rapprochement, or at least this nuclear agreement, knew that the hardliners in Iran, the Revolutionary Guards, the Supreme Leader would probably pull the plug on diplomacy if these attacks had happened. So I argue in the book, and the White House still argues that these were separate issues, but I argue that the Iranians basically were communicating either directly or through others that, if these attacks happen, this diplomacy could very much get derailed. And if you see what happened from 2013 through the end of the Obama administration, there really was an incredible shift in U.S. policy. Obama, in the early parts of the revolution in Syria, was calling for Assad to resign, to step down. By 2014, he was sending messages to the supreme leader that basically said, look, if we can get this nuclear agreement finalized, we can cooperate with you against the Islamic State. You should know that our military operations inside Syria are not targeting the Assad regime. The U.S. basically was having the rebel groups that we were supporting inside Syria basically commit to not attack the Assad regime. So the U.S. policy very much kind of shifted during the negotiations to almost being allied with Iran, and I don't think this was a coincidence. I think this was part of Obama's desire to sort of kind of reorient U.S. strategy in the Middle East in a lot of ways, which in a lot of ways brings us to the actual the agreement, which played out over 2 years of pretty intense negotiations. And there's still a lot of debate about, was this a good agreement? Were the Americans too lax? Did we kind of appease the Iranians? And I think the way I try to look at it is, if you look at the red lines the United States had at the beginning of the Obama administration of what we thought was an acceptable Iranian nuclear program, it was pretty strict. It was basically they should not have the ability to enrich uranium, to reprocess plutonium, to have the ability to produce nuclear fuel because it's inherently dual use, and the Iranians have repeatedly been caught cheating over the past few decades, whether it was building reactors or enrichment facilities or what the United States and the UN nuclear watchdog believe was clandestine weapons work. So that was where the red lines were. And throughout this negotiation, throughout this process, it was pretty remarkable in my estimation how the Iranians were able to push the United States back from these kind of very hardline positions. I think what was interesting in the negotiations in all these European capitals, where you had this diplomatic team of the Iranians who almost all had studied in the United States, they spoke English, they knew our system very well, compared to the U.S. side, which was comprised of diplomats. And part of this is because of the historic rivalry between the United States and Iran since the '79 revolution that just didn't have that much kind of history with the Iranians. And I think the Iranians were very adept at kind of playing our system and against ourselves in some ways. The Iranians, I know, would have cite the supreme leader as having this very harsh position and that they were only able to move so much. And I thought the U.S. side didn't use our own political differences as a wedge or a leverage against the United States, because you had a Congress that was very, reluctant to cut a deal, and Obama was always very much like, we're going to veto anything that the Congress does or tries to oppose this deal. So I think through that process, the Iranians were very adept at understanding our system, and it was remarkable if you see how much leverage the United States had in 2013, 2014, as this process built up. Like I said, their oil exports were cut in half. The price of oil was collapsing, and they were basically forced to revert to a barter trade. And despite appearing for the United States to having so much leverage, they were able in some ways to move the position of the United States into alignment with theirs. And I think in a lot of ways this gets to the point to what Obama was hoping for or perceiving, and I think he really was making a big political bet. If you go to Iran and you meet the people and you see the system, I think the stereotypes you hear are very true. This is a very young population, very pro-American, probably the most pro-American outside of Israel in the Middle East. And you have a system where the revolutionaries, the Ayatollahs, are getting on. They're in their 70s. You just had one of the leaders of the revolution, Ayatollah Rafsanjani, die a few weeks ago. So I think the Obama administration was making a bet that, look, we can't have a conflict right now. We can't get dragged into a war that maybe the Israelis will launch. So let's get this interim agreement. Let's get some sort of diplomatic engagement in play. And know that in 10 or 15 years, the politics are going to be very different, because if you look at the terms of the deal, Iran can have an industrial scale program in 10 to 15 years. They can be this close to basically having weapons grade fuel, but if the politics play out as President Obama hopes, I think you're not as concerned. But I think the downside and the risks that I think we've seen since the deal was concluded is that the Iranians have shown absolutely no sign of moderation so far. You've probably noticed in recent weeks, you've had continuing tests of ballistic missiles. You've had the detainment or arrests of more Iranian Americans, more Iranians from France, from the UK. So on these two fronts, the threats have not resolved at all. And I think one of the more kind of criticisms you could make, or the arguments that the U.S. was a bit naive, was there was definitely a hope that this deal, when it was resolved, that you'd get the Iranians, you'd get the Russians to cooperate with the United States to end the war in Syria, maybe to eventually dislodge President Assad. And what we now know is that the Russians and the Iranians were very much plotting, even during the nuclear negotiations, to basically double down in Syria, to expand their role in the war there, and to essentially assure, at least for now, that the Assad regime survives. I think it was within weeks after the deal was concluded in July 2015, the Russians and the Iranians started very much a joint military operation, where the Russians were doing the air campaign and the Iranians had mobilized thousands of Shia militia from across the region to support the Assad regime. And we're to the point now where the Russians are actually launching military operations from inside Iran into Syria, something I think most experts of Iran would find amazing, because it's such a nationalist, there's such nationalist fervor in that country. Historically, the Russians and the Iranians are rivals. So this hope, at least early on, that there could be support, some sort of cooperation in Syria, has not borne out. Which takes me now to looking ahead and the Trump administration, and where does this agreement that was in a lot of ways historic, that was the signature foreign policy of the Obama administration, where does it go? I think if you look at the people around President Trump, you probably couldn't find a more hawkish group towards Iran, whether it's the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, to first it was General Flynn, now General McRaven, to Mike Pompeo at the CIA. A lot of these guys, particularly the military guys, were in Iraq, and there is a lot of bad blood. I don't think you can underestimate, the wars in Iraq, the role the Iranians played in shipping explosives to the Shia militias who were targeting the United States. The Americans, particularly in the National Security Council, they remember this. So what happened in the first few weeks of the Trump administration? You saw them say that Iran is basically on a watch, that they imposed sanctions on 25 Revolutionary Guard companies. And I think when they say there's a heightened focus on Iran, where I think there's the potential for conflict or a real standoff is in the Gulf. Over the last year or so, you've seen heightened efforts by Iranian naval vessels to target American or allied ships. You've seen in Yemen a movement there called the Houthis, who are backed by the Iranians, target Saudi, Emirati, and American naval ships. The Americans are supporting the Saudi war in Yemen. So I think there is a risk that tensions in the Gulf could really escalate under a Trump administration. I don't think the Trump plan for Iran is to tear up this nuclear deal. I think what the strategy is to really vigorously enforce it. And you hear on the more cynical side from some of the people around Trump that, if we really vigorously enforce this deal, if we sanction Revolutionary Guard companies for what they're doing in Syria or human rights violations back at home, the Iranians might just back out of the deal themselves, and the pressure and the blame will basically be placed on Iran for an agreement that the Trump administration thinks was a weak deal. On the other side, I still think there's a possibility, although probably not a likelihood, that the business side of whether it's President Trump or Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Trump did in the campaign make conflicting statements sometimes. He'd say the deal was terrible, but then he'd say, well, how come European and Asian companies now are kind of rushing into Iran and the United States can't? And Secretary Tillerson, in some of his statements, particularly during the congressional hearing, was saying, he was not always a fan of sanctions. It might not be the best tool, that engaging American companies is important. So I do think there is a possibility that the Trump administration could basically say, look, let's renegotiate this deal. It was weak, but if the Iranians agree to more constraints on their program, basically not agreeing to a sunset clause, which is what the deal is, that the restraints will only last 10 years, that they'll be extended. You could possibly see a Trump administration say, look, if Iran agrees to these greater constraints, we will really lift sanctions. We'll promote American companies going back into Iran, energy companies, whether it's ExxonMobil or others. So I do think, on the one hand, if you look at the constellation of people around President Trump, the potential for a conflict is real, but I still think, and it's such early days, there is a potential for the business side, the negotiator side of Donald Trump to basically try to double down. But that is going to have to play itself out. One of the first leaders to go to the White House was Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who you could almost feel was giddy when he was there, because the relationship with President Obama was so nasty, and there was so much disagreement and discord over the Iran agreement, that he thinks in Donald Trump he has a partner to really kind of start turning the screws again. The Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians have basically said they won't support a renegotiation, but part of I think the story of the past 8 years is that when Americans business, when the financial community gets involved and basically makes the argument that was made under Bush and Obama, that you can either do business with Iran or you can do business with the United States. If that strategy comes back into play, I think it's harder than most people realize for Europe and some of these Asian allies to basically go their own way and not stay on side with the United States. So I think that this is very much what's going to play out over the next 12, 18 months. And I think the Iran wars, as the book is called, are very much going to stay in the news. So I will end it there, and thank you very much.
Questions, Leo, and we'll get the microphone to you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Campbell. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. And I was wondering if you could speak to whether or not the United States' shifting relationship with Russia may have an impact on the United States' relationship with Iran, and if so, how?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because the Trump administration, it's such an unclear policy right now, but one of the guiding kind of trends you could pick up already is that there's a hope that the U.S. could sort of drive a wedge between Iran and Russia, which have very much created this tight alliance over the past 5 years. Whether they can do that, I think, is very much in question. But the U.S. hope is that, Iran and Russia, they're not natural allies. The Persian Empire was kind of cut up in some ways by the czars, so there's this historical rivalry. I think the hope is that, particularly in Syria, that the Iranian government has no choice but to support the Assad regime. President Assad has been so willing to support Hezbollah and Hamas that, the Russians might kind of agree that Assad, you're never really going to stabilize that country while Assad is there, so they might be more willing to part with Assad than others. So I think that is what the Trump administration is hoping, that by engaging with the Russians, they could get a change in Syria. The question is, what would Russia demand in return? Certainly sanctions being lifted, some maybe acceptance of Crimea. I think that these tensions are what's playing out, and I think it's such early days. I will say the early signs from the Trump administration on Russia, despite all the rhetoric, you haven't seen a huge shift. I know they've said they'd support Montenegro joining NATO, which is not going to be welcomed in the Kremlin. Secretary Tillerson is kind of recommitted to sanctions on Crimea. Vice President Pence very much has talked about strengthening NATO. So despite all the rhetoric, the policy itself hasn't seemed to change that much. But I think there's probably going to be negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, and all this stuff is going to be in play.
Yes, got a question right here. Oh, here comes the microphone. Yep.
Thanks, Rob. I was wondering about the use of cyber warfare against Iranian nuclear equipment.
Yeah.
The centrifuges. Was there other aspects of this that we didn't see reported? I think this kind of slipped out as far as I think it was the Stuxnet. Yeah, virus that went in. Were there other types of cyber warfare that went in here? And where does that kind of lead us as a world?
Yeah. No, that's interesting, because there has been a lot of debate. It was a joint American-Israeli cyber attack on Iran's enrichment facilities, and it's been described as the first time a state has used a cyber attack on another country, and it was effective in some ways. It did set back Iran's program. Maybe you had centrifuges spinning out of control, but the Iranians kind of recovered pretty quickly and figured out something was wrong. So I think there was, and there is still, a debate about, was passing this threshold, this Rubicon on using a cyber weapon worth what was probably just pushing the Iranians back a few months. And you could see the Iranians figure it out. And in the second Obama term, there were cyber attacks on American banks that the United States intelligence agency traced back to Iranian hackers. So I think they kind of learned. And from our last election, the accusations against Russia, cyber hacking, attacking American institutions, critics will say, the Americans kind of let the genie out of the bottle, and now you're seeing it used on a much wider scale. You asked, were there other elements of it? I've heard from U.S. officials, though it's hard to nail down, that during parts of the negotiations over the nuclear issue, the Americans basically were telling the Iranians, we have mapped out essentially all of your critical infrastructure, from dams to electrical grids to other, probably the stock exchange. We have mapped all this stuff out, and if push comes to shove, we could take it out through another cyber attack, and that was used as leverage. So I think there was more than just this initial attack that was focused on what's called, it's a facility called Natanz, that there was a broader cyber strategy campaign that could have been unleashed if there wasn't an agreement. But I think you're right. The question is now, has the genie been put out of the let out of the bottle? Is cyber warfare now a much more common occurrence, and it's hard for the U.S. to come back when we were the first to really use it.
You have a question right here. Yeah, here comes the microphone.
Yes, my question was very similar to that one, but I guess from your perspective, you talked a lot about red lines. Mm-hmm. Where would you draw the red line with regard to cyber attack on core U.S. infrastructure?
That's difficult. I mean, there has been a lot of talk some of it wasn't true, that the Russians had attacked dams in Vermont, that the Iranians, I don't think this was in dispute, but the Iranians had hit banks. But I think it's such a new type of warfare that internationally there still are there are no standards. You talk to the Europeans now, they're all seeing signs of the Russians getting involved in the French election, the German election. So I think there needs to be some standard, but clearly if critical infrastructure is being hit, if they're undermining your ability to conduct a democratic election because you can't, information is being leaked, or, it could get even worse, I think there does need to be real standards. But I think it's such a new type of warfare that it hasn't really been decided upon. But even on the economic side, I think when I personally think that the financial warfare the United States unleashed on Iran had way more impact than any of these cyber attacks. I mean, something like 60% of Iran's state revenue comes from oil, and we cut 2/3 of that off in 12, 14 months. Iran has said this is, in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. You can't do that. So it's not just the cyber. I think the financial side too probably needs new standards. And you talk to the Trump administration, certainly on North Korea, they want to replicate what they did in Iran against the North Koreans. Basically, it's harder. It's not it's not an oil exporter. It's not a country that is not as integrated, but certainly something like 60% of North Korea's trade, or maybe even higher, goes through China. So if the United States started to target Chinese companies, banks for doing business with North Korea, which we've seen signs of it, I think you could do some real damage in North Korea. The question is, does the United States want to go there? Do they want to antagonize the Chinese?
When your father was working with Kissinger and Nixon and opening up China, he said the difficult part was finding common interests. Do you see the possibility of some catastrophic event in the Middle East in which we would have a common enemy, and that would bring us closer with Iran?
I love that you knew that history. It's interesting. My dad actually wrote an article about 18 months ago, looking at trying to do an analogy between Nixon's outreach to China and Obama's to Iran. And he was a bit skeptical because with China, you had a real shared enemy in the Soviet Union, which had tanks on the Chinese border. You had a leader in China that really wanted to open up the economy, that wanted to globalize. You had, the end of the Vietnam War. So there were really shared interests with China. And, you could see it, ping-pong diplomacy, this cultural engagement. The Chinese wanted the Americans in China. They brought Nixon in. The Iran thing has been very different. The hope is that the shared enemy is the Islamic State, that it's Al-Qaeda, that it's Sunni extremism, and that we could build an alliance basically with that common threat. What's been discouraging about the events since the Iran agreement is that there hasn't been this desire on the Iranian side really to go at all beyond this nuclear deal. I know President Obama would have loved to have met Iran's president at the United Nations. I know Secretary Kerry was dying to visit Tehran, but there was just no desire. Even if I think there are probably elements of the Iranian regime that want to normalize relations, but they're so wary about being outflanked by hardline elements inside that regime that the last thing President Rouhani wanted was a photo op with President Obama, because it would have exposed him inside his own system. It's being used against him in these elections that are happening in the spring. So I think it is early days, but the hope that you could see some sort of rapprochement with Iran like there was with China, it hasn't taken root yet. And Iran and the Russians and the Syrians, that alliance, they really do show kind of conflicting signs. Inside Syria, their military operations have been almost solely against American-backed rebels or kind of the more moderate factions. They haven't really gone after the Islamic State. It's been more about the rebels that were backed by the West. So the early signs of that analogy of some Nixon's China moment, I haven't seen it, but like it's only been 18 months. Maybe it will take root, but the initial signs aren't great.
Yep. Good question.
So I was a little surprised when you said that U.S. didn't really give up, Iran didn't give up much, the U.S. did. I thought from the very beginning, Iran insisted, and Ayatollah made this point partway through the negotiations, that they would never allow inspections throughout, particularly their military facilities. I thought they, in fact, gave up on that point, which was a critical one. Am I wrong in that?
Like a lot of the stuff, it's very technical, but to me, you're right. There was a big debate about access to Iranian nuclear sites, military sites, how much access the UN inspectors would get. And I actually think one of the most kind of the weakest parts of the agreement was going in, the United States always said the Iranians have to come clean to some extent on how far did they get in weaponization work, how close did they get to actually developing the technologies for a bomb. And 3 months in October of 2015, the IAEA inspectors did get to visit this one military site called Parchin, which U.S. intelligence believed weaponization work happened. And we did a story last year that the inspectors actually did find at that site traces of uranium, man-made uranium, which U.S. officials would say the only reason it would have been there, almost for certain, was it was part of some weaponization work. But these inspections happened after the deal was already concluded. So we, in the paper, were amazed. This was a year, 2 years before would have been seen as a smoking gun. Instead, it was kind of just, they never followed up on it. And I know the UN inspectors have not been allowed back in to any military sites since then. So I think one of the fears, and I think the Obama administration would say, look, we've capped their program. So the fear of a cascade, the Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, these other countries who are rivals with Iran, they're going to be less concerned. They're not going to try to go down the nuclear path because of the restraints. That's the former administration's argument. I think there's a risk, though, that if you're the Saudis, you're looking at Iran, and you know that in 10 to 15 years, they are going to be able to produce nuclear fuel on an industrial scale. And I don't think anyone really knows how close they got to a bomb. And the fact that the IAEA didn't follow up on these inspections in this Parchin site, I think because they know that the Iranians are so resistant, it's a real danger, particularly when they're shooting off ballistic missiles every 2 to 3 months. I mean, there's not really a reason to be developing a ballistic missile capability unless you want to put a warhead on it at some point. So I think there is a risk that that the Saudis, and you already hear the Saudis talking about buying reactors from Korea and other places, that they're kind of gaming it out 10, 15 years down the road, which is not a long time, and they're going to argue we should have the same capacity, the same technologies that Iran has. And how is the United States or these other countries going to come back and say, no, you can't enrich uranium, despite the fact that we're letting Iran have 100,000 centrifuges in 15 years. It's going to be, the risk of the cascade, I think, is a real one if you look down the track, because their capacity is going to be there, and I don't think anyone really knows how close they got to a bomb.
Listen, I know there's time we got more questions. I know people want to ask him, but we've also got to save some time for him to visit and sign this book. So if you have a question, just join him at the signing table. Let's thank Jay Solomon and the Iran Wars for being at the Flint School.